Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining me for cultural competence and unintended bias. It's a great and exciting topic. If you're working with a lot of diversity, it will help you to stay on target with what happens sometimes when we're trying to provide great service, when we're trying to provide great support. It'll give some insight into perhaps how people from other cultures think, some wellness information. What does it mean to be well if you are Black, Indigenous, person of color, and how we can go about healing some of the issues that happen with bias and without having cultural competence. So, thank you so much for coming. And I want to set kind of the space before we actually jump into the material. Whenever I teach a course like this, it's very sensitive, and the information can be upsetting. It can make you feel uncomfortable. All of those things are very normal to feel with this type of information. But in this space, I want to make sure that you feel safe, that it's without judgment. I don't expect anybody to know all the information. I don't expect anybody to be aware of different perspectives. We're all here to learn and to take that path of learning together. So typically, I talk about the sacred circle. And the sacred circle is used in many, many cultures. This particular circle happens to come from people in South Africa. And it's meant to signify that we are all equal. We are equally important. And therefore, we are all equidistant from the center of the circle. So I'm here facilitating information, but I'm also here to learn from all of you that I'm teaching. So we're in this together. We are shoulder to shoulder, often in sacred circle. The idea is carrying the burdens of life together. So we're sitting shoulder to shoulder, we're carrying each other's burdens, we are sharing information, we are learning information, and this is a safe space to do that. Each person is the beginning of the circle, and each person is also the end of the circle. So we are here, even as we are virtual. When we're in this training, we are in that same sacred circle space, following that sacred circle culture. In many traditions, and if you have been to Hawaii before, I'm sure you have seen the signs that say mahalo for removing your shoes. And a lot of this culture comes from some of the Asian cultures. A lot of this practice comes from a lot of the Asian cultures. Of course, the idea is that we're not taking dirt from the outside, right? Physical dirt on the bottom of our shoes and bringing it into a sacred space. So maybe that sacred space is a religious space, or maybe that sacred space is our home. But I have a very special grandma from the Philippines, and she says, your feet are your foundation, and your shoes protect you. The home is the place for vulnerability and love. And that's the same space that I like to create in this training. So everyone can feel free to be vulnerable and to be safe, to know that regardless of your perspective and wherever you come from, this is a space for love and a space for vulnerability. So at this time, I invite everyone to remove your shoes. of course, either physically or spiritually. James Baldwin, I love this quote from James Baldwin, famous African-American writer who was at the intersection of many groups. He was African-American, he was LGBTQ at a time, of course, when this was not acceptable, especially difficult in Black communities. And at one point in his career, he started to be accepted, and he started to be invited into many special circles and of accomplished writers, of course, being one of the only Black men, being one of the only openly LGBTQ community members. And there was this question about inclusivity and really belonging. You know, it's one thing to include someone. It's another thing for that person to really belong. And what he found was he was often invited to country clubs and different dinners and events with this well-established group of writers and famous people. But the attitude was always, it's fine for you to come, but now you have a seat at the table, but close your mouth and don't bring too many like you along. We're just, tolerating you. And he said, we can disagree and still love each other unless your disagreement is rooted in my oppression and denial of my humanity and right to exist. Okay. If we are not familiar, there has for a very long time been an issue of missing and murdered Indigenous women. It continues to be such a big issue today that several years ago, the governor of Arizona put more money toward information and research about missing and murdered Indigenous women. And this is a poetry piece that will talk a bit about that topic.
With that, I'm going to kind of go into my poem. It's called MMIW, Pocahontas. She is probably one of our most famous missing, murdered Indigenous women, and nobody knows it because she was romanticized into this role. So this is what it's called. When the president called Elizabeth Warren Pocahontas, he thought he was being funny and clever, only confirming the idolization of a child that has been turned into a fetish. In 2017, nearly 10,000 Indigenous women were reported missing in the U.S. Her real name was Matawoka. Powhatan, for flower between two streams, she resembled her mother, so they took on her name, Pocahontas. Dies at 21, taken by English captors. Ask yourself, if your favorite princess were alive today, would she be hashtagging Me Too? Taking her name back for all Indigenous women, screaming, I survived. In 1995, she becomes a Disney princess. She becomes a Halloween costume. Her 10-year-old body becomes full-figured, a Barbie doll collectible. It's the year that John Smith's story becomes a musical starring a rape victim. It's the year that I learned I had to know all the colors of the wind. It's the year that I learned that saving white men always makes you the hero. 1617, our daughter dies in England. Renamed Rebecca, a good Christian name for a good Indian. How else was she being accepted if she was a whitewashed, language lost, new name, new clothes, new her? Would we have put out an Amber Alert? Posted pictures of her assailants, described this ship in details, filed her name along with the others. We are still searching for her bones, wanting to bring her home. When you call Native women Pocahontas, your breath reeks of a missing persons report. When you call us Pocahontas, it means little girls tickle your fancy. Murdered missing Indigenous women is no recent epidemic, and you wonder why we are so quick to go to battle. It's because history has never been kind to our women. Thank you.
So I love showing that video because there's so many people that don't realize that that's the story of Pocahontas, and how much stereotyping and bias and created story there is around a serious issue that has impacted a whole group of people. So, regardless, all the tribes have been affected by it. It's not one tribe, it's Native American, it's indigenous women across the United States through Canada that have been murdered and missing all of this time, and it has been acceptable and tolerated. So, if we start to talk about stereotypes, we're referring to beliefs that certain attributes, characteristics, and behaviors are typical of members of a particular group. And there are benefits to stereotypes, and of course, there's negative, right, to stereotypes. So, some of the benefits of stereotyping is that the human brain has the natural tendency to categorize everything. So, when we utilize stereotypes, it frees up space for other tasks. We at any time, our brain is bombarded with an infinite number of stimuli. So, without an efficient method of making sense of certain information, our brains would become overloaded and we wouldn't be able to accomplish certain tasks. So, it's natural that our brain would start to categorize things. Now, what we have to look at is when it becomes negative. So, the tendency to stereotype comes from generally people who have a greater need to control. So, people that struggle to be regulated, right? If we're talking about trauma and regulation and self-regulation, we know that people that are dysregulated and have that need to control something, they are way more likely to utilize stereotypes and to utilize stereotypes in a very negative fashion. So the problems with stereotypes, well, we know that stereotypes are socially constructed. So sometimes they inform us about generalizations of a group of people, and it could be true, for example. So, for instance, like younger people typically have better hearing than older people, right? So that's a stereotype, but often that's going to be true. But many of the stereotypes that we follow are invalid, particularly if they're race, religion, or gender based. So, because of this, the stereotypes can become negative and counterproductive and certainly hurtful, especially when we work with a diverse group of people. Often, stereotypes can be arbitrary, right? So, not using the example that we just used, hearing with younger people versus hearing in older people, that's not arbitrary, right? That's logical. If you're older, your hearing will have deteriorated. That makes sense, with science. That makes sense with how the human body works. But a lot of times, right, they're just arbitrary. And so we know that there's no social group that's completely homogenous, right? So stereotypes may not be accurate in how they are describing an entire group of people, which becomes problematic, which becomes hurtful, which can move into being discriminatory. Stereotypes are biased. So, what we know through research is that we believe that individuals from the same social group are more alike than they really are. So, we believe that people from the same social group are most of the time the same, And what we find out is that's actually not true. And we also tend to exaggerate the differences between social groups. And, for instance, somebody like an American may believe that all Germans are the same and that they're very different from Italians. And lastly, we talk about prejudice and discrimination, and we know that we often shape our beliefs about people through stereotypes. So if we have stereotypes that are persistent, we then shape our whole belief system around one group in a negative way. And prejudice is commonly associated with stereotypes. Our evaluations of others reflect what we believe to be true about them. And we can see where that can become dangerous when we are working as colleagues with a diverse group of people, or when we are serving in some provider capacity, when we're serving a diverse group of people. If we have one way in our mind that we perceive these people to be, then obviously, right, that's going to impact how we serve them. That's going to impact how we interact with different people. It's going to impact how we lead them. It's going to impact our friendships, our relationships with people. People with strong egalitarian social norms will not be as likely to discriminate against people, even if there are stereotypes that exist. So in other words, people like in Native American communities that have the belief system of everybody being equal, everybody being the same, everybody being interconnected, it's less likely that there'll be issues of prejudice and discrimination when people come from that particular background, the egalitarian background. But when we're talking about societies that are not egalitarian, like Western culture, it's very difficult to have those stereotypes and not have them morph into prejudice and discrimination. One of the very difficult things in terms of bias and prejudice and so forth is the unconscious bias, because this means that stereotyping and associated responses are autonomic and unconscious. So a great example of this was a study that was done where there was a video game being played. And in this particular video game, you had a house with intruders coming in. And the person playing the video game needed to indicate with their controller when the intruder was carrying a deadly weapon. So they had white intruders and they had black intruders. And so the people playing the video game were way more likely to respond that the intruder had a weapon when it was a black intruder versus a white intruder. The interesting piece about this is that it didn't matter if the people playing the video game were people of color or or white people. It didn't matter because both groups signaled that the intruder had a deadly weapon more often when the intruder was black. So we can see where this unconscious bias is a problem and something that we have to be very cautious about and pay attention to as we move forward, because this is essentially what we're talking about that's happening in the world right now today, right? When we're talking about so much police brutality and we're talking about so many instances of violence within the community, with people of color, we have to take a look at this issue of unconscious bias and how it's affecting the brain, how it's affecting us neurologically, and how it's autonomic and unconscious. So we're not making a choice, a conscious choice, to react in a certain way. This is a bias that's unconscious, which is really important, right? To take a look at and to start to recognize and to break some of these things down. And to really have a different perspective of one another, people of color, having a different perspective of people that are outside Black, Indigenous people of color, and people that are outside of Black, Indigenous people of color, their perception of Black, Indigenous people of color, right? We have to be very careful and start to pay attention to how we view people, what someone else's perspective is, what someone else's culture is, how they think, how they perceive the world, how we experience the world, because we all experience the world in a very different way. So we all have to learn to take our specific lenses off and put another set of lenses on and understand that everybody does not experience the world in the same way that we do. And once we get a good idea about that, I think then we start to change this issue of unconscious bias. So if we look at stereotype resistance, so stereotypes are maintained and reinforced by powerful mental biases that filter out information that contradicts or challenges the pre-existing beliefs and attitudes. So we have several different types of stereotype resistance. We have attribution bias. So when a person behaves in accordance with the stereotype, we attribute that behavior to stereotypical characteristic that they share with other members of the group. And this goes ahead and reinforces that stereotype. But if an individual behaves in the opposite way of the stereotype, we're more likely to attribute that behavior to some other external cause, preserving the integrity of the stereotype. So I, as a Black woman, experience this often, as an example, when I'm articulating, or if I form a relationship with someone perhaps that's not used to having relationship with a woman of color. And because I articulate in a certain way, or because I present in a certain way, it will often be said to me, oh, well, you're not like them. I mean, you're a little bit different. You're not really, like them. You're different. Because they've got to, if you have this stereotype in your head and the person is not matching up and speaking in a way that you're used to seeing a person of color speak, or dressing in a way that you're used to seeing a person of color dress, you have to explain it away. That's attribution bias. Similarly, research shows that we pay more attention to action that is consistent with the stereotype and less attention to action that contradicts the stereotype. So we're paying way more attention if the person is acting in accordance with the stereotype. Yep, we're going right along with it. If the person is not paying attention to, if the person is not in alignment with the stereotype, we're less likely to be paying attention to it. Subtyping. When a member of a stereotype group displays counter stereotypical qualities, this could invoke some subtyping. So subtyping involves the explaining of exceptions by assigning that individual to a subcategory of the stereotyped group rather than modifying the original stereotype. So instead of saying, well, maybe, that stereotype about Native Americans or African Americans, maybe it's not quite right. Instead of changing our idea of the stereotype, we take that individual that's acting outside of that stereotype and we subtype. Well, that they act like that because they come from this particular area, so they don't act like the rest of them. Or they act like that because they went to college out of state, and so they're different than the others. So this is where it becomes very dangerous, because once we start with the stereotype, it's very difficult for us to let that go. It's very difficult to allow our evaluation of other people become altered and let go of that stereotype. And the self-fulfilling prophecy comes when we have people that belong to a group that are stereotyped in a specific way. They themselves start to believe that they need to behave in the way of the stereotype, even if that's not natural to their own behavior. And this is a very interesting piece, because as a mother of several Black sons, at various points in each one of my boys' lives, I've seen this come to fruition. There's some place where they start to feel like they need to behave outside of how they've been groomed, outside of how they've been raised, and behave in a way that the media says that Black males behave. There becomes a lot of confusion. And in working in many different Native American communities, I've seen the same things happening, especially with males. This confusion that comes along because of the self-fulfilling prophecy of a stereotype that's in place. And this is why the stereotypes are so dangerous and why we have to be so careful of them, because they're autonomic, right? We start to automatically think and perceive people in a certain way. And because it causes the individuals that are in that group that's being stereotyped to have some level of confusion about behaviors, who they are, who they want to be, and what's really inherent in them, and what's really true to who they are. So these are some of the forms of stereotype resistance. I think as we move forward and we look at serving Black, Indigenous people of color, we have to look at what does it mean to be well for Black, Indigenous people of color, because that definition varies from group to group, and it can vary for non-Western based people. If we're always looking at a Western perspective, which says wellness is perhaps the absence of dis-ease, or wellness is just the idea of the psyche being well and the physical body being well, then we're only looking at wellness through a limited perspective, and it will be very difficult to impact the wellness of Black, Indigenous people of color. It will be very difficult to understand perspective. So let's take a look at what that means to be well. Harmony with nature and the universe. Western culture typically does not always consider themselves at one with nature, right? This is some of the reason why we have some issues with cutting down too many trees, right? Or carbon footprint and so forth and so on. Because as Westerners, we don't always see ourselves as part of nature. We are on top of the nature, if you will. You know, we're walking on the nature. We don't consider ourselves at one with nature or at one and in harmony, or the need to be in harmony with nature and the universe. But when we work, and specifically, we can see this very clearly often when we work in Native American community, there is still this underlying ethos that says we need to be in harmony with the nature, having harmony with family. Working often with Black, Indigenous people of color, there's often this emphasis of the importance of family relationships, right? Sometimes, from a Western perspective, it can almost feel extreme that the family relationship is too important. For instance, if we're working with a family and let's say grandparents are raising grandchildren and parents maybe are having a substance issue or are maybe incarcerated, from a Western perspective, it becomes apparent that we need to limit the parent's interaction with the child in order to keep the child safe and in order to restore the family. And that's a very logical perspective, right? Because at the top of our list is always keeping children safe. But from a Black, Indigenous, person of color perspective, we create a new challenge when we just cut off a family member and isolate a family member, because many of our values say that we embrace family when they're in trouble and when they're struggling. We embrace community members when they're in trouble or when they're struggling. We don't isolate. So if we don't look at this piece that teaches us that many Indigenous people have an ethos that says we have to value family, we have to be in relationship with family. If we don't always consider that, we might fix one part of the problem, right? We might facilitate wellness in one aspect of an issue that's going on, but we create a problem in another aspect. So we have to keep in mind, how do we protect children while still embracing family members so that we stay in harmony with family and we can have that wellness, that balance. You know, we need a balance of all of these entities in order to have wellness. Harmony within the community. Maybe we've worked with people that live in a strong community where a strong, let's say, Mexican American community, and a person feels that how the rest of the community views them is extremely important, right? And sometimes as Western people, we think, well, you know, you shouldn't care what the rest of the community thinks, or you have to rise above that and it shouldn't matter to you, and so forth and so on. And that's great advice and that's a great perspective. But there's also a perspective for many Indigenous people that say, we have to be in harmony with community. How's my relationship with everybody in the community? Is that well? And if those relationships are not well, then it will be difficult to establish overall wellness. Economic harmony, another space. So not to say we need to be wealthy, not to say we need to have excess, but economic harmony in the place of do we have enough for what we must accomplish in day-to-day life? Do we have enough to take care of all of the bills and all of the family members and all of the things that we are responsible for? And then, of course, we still have to look at physical, spiritual, and psychological health. And all of these components really make up Black, Indigenous, people of color wellness. And it is profound when you're working with Native American communities, because many Native American communities are still connected to egalitarian and tribal ways of being. A lot of this will be very apparent when working with those communities, but it will also be maybe a little more distant, but still relevant in working in African American communities or African communities or Latinx communities, so forth and so on. Next, we have to take a look at structural racism. We often get confused, I think, about the term racism and structural racism, and understanding and being able to differentiate the different types of racism. I think the big picture that we have to focus on is this idea of structural racism. Dr. Tricia Rose out of Brown University, I love the work that she's doing with structural racism. You can Google her, you can look her up on YouTube, and she has numerous videos that talk about structural racism. And she defines it as structural racism in the United States is the normalization and legitimization of an array of dynamics, historical, cultural, institutional, interpersonal, that routinely advantage some individuals while producing cumulative and chronic adverse outcome for people of color. So I think it's an important definition for several reasons, but it also addresses this idea of one group of individuals being advantaged while another group of individuals having chronic and cumulative adverse outcomes, right? So we have this big gap in between. The idea of structural racism can also be described as many gears. And again, this is Dr. Tricia Rose's work, and she has a fantastic way, really, of describing some of this. Now, there are many different pieces and many different sectors in society that contribute to this overall massive engine, which is structural racism. But she breaks it down into these 5 components. So let's take a look at how this all works. If we look at the gear, let's start in the middle, and we look at this gear of housing, okay? And we start to turn the gear. The housing gear starts to turn. Let's look at the fact that in United States history, we have this history of redlining. And this is not, this is information that is well known, and you can Google it, look it up to get more information about it. We can't go into big detail about it here, but what happened, the United States government literally took a red marker and redlined certain areas in the United States that were for people of color. And in those particular areas, you will not be eligible for mortgages, and people that are trying to start small businesses won't be able to get business loans in these particular redlined areas. So it started with the United States government and this redlining, and then it was perpetuated by real estate agents and the whole housing market. So even in my time, I remember this very, very, very clearly. I grew up in New York City. My parents decided they wanted to move to the suburbs. My mother had it in her mind that she wanted to move to a city called Teaneck. She got a realtor, and I can still remember to this day, I was probably like 6 years old, so we're talking in the 70s. And we get in the car with the realtor, we start looking at property, and automatically the realtor takes us to a particular part of town where you had mostly black people. And so my mother is looking around and she's going, take me to another area to look at. And so we drive to another area that had black people. And so my mother, she's finally saying, no, I want to go, show me the other side of town. What's in that direction? And finally, after prodding and prodding and prodding, we start looking into areas that are more diverse, right? So we have a long history in this country of having housing for people of color and then housing for dominant culture, right? Now, if you live in a particular area, you will have perhaps not the same educational opportunities as someone that lives in another area, right? So what we know is that in areas that are predominantly Black or predominantly Native American or Latin X, the education is not as good as some of the other areas, right? So now we have the housing gear spinning, and the housing gear has engaged the education gear, because if you live in this area, then you're going to get a particular type of education. Well, if you get a lesser education, it's going to impact your wealth, right? So now we're spinning the wealth gear. So if we go in the opposite direction and we look at housing, and we have housing that is set up for a particular group of people, people of color, then we're going to have a higher level of criminal justice activity, right? We're going to have more police officers. We're going to have a more, potentially a more aggressive stance from police officers because of some of the unconscious bias that we have, right? So now we have the criminal justice gear spinning. And the more arrests that are made, the more the media gets involved, and the more the media says, hey, look in these communities of color, and look at all of this violence that's going on. Look at how these people behave. And now we have all of these gears that spinning in order to empower this massive engine of structural racism. So this is what people are talking about when they talk about structural racism. We're not talking about do I as an individual have the right to the same job as someone with a similar educational and experience background as I do. That's a form of racism, right? That's one thing. But what we're talking about is how all of these sectors work together to perpetuate structural racism. Because as long as we can only live in certain areas and get a certain level of education often, and impact wealth, impact criminal justice, which then gives an impression in the media, and then people see the media and get an impression of people of color, And then this feeds into this unconscious bias, right? We see where all of this is going. Let's take a look at how a case study might look on structural racism. Let's say we have a young person of color, and they have moved into a particular housing community. What we know from history is that once a particular housing community becomes 20% Black, Indigenous, people of color, dominant culture or white people start to move out. This is not, these are not my statistics. This is well-known data. So once a neighborhood becomes 20% Black, Indigenous, people of color, we have what they call white flight. Now, we have white flight, but there'll be a certain number of white people that maybe can't leave or maybe choose not to leave. But they'll start to feel uncomfortable by the number of Black, Indigenous people in the community. So perhaps we engage a neighborhood watch system, right? Or we create, some kind of neighborhood watch. So we have neighborhood watch. We have neighborhood watch because of unconscious bias. We have whoever's in charge of the neighborhood watch or whoever's a part of the neighborhood watch are extra sensitive to Black, Indigenous, people of color, right? Because we have this unconscious bias, which has been fueled perhaps by the media. And now we have a young Black, Indigenous person of color that has been suspended from school. What we know is, again, this is statistics, this is data, that Black, Indigenous, people of color, depending on the area, depending on if we're talking about Black students or if we're talking about Native American or Latinx students, can be anywhere between 2 to 8 times more likely to be suspended than a white student. So now we have an issue of Black, Indigenous, child of color, suspended from school, maybe living in a community where there's been white flight and some sensitivity around Black, Indigenous, people of color. And this youth of color is out walking on the street. Somebody from the neighborhood watch community feels intimidated, feels uncomfortable, engages the youth of color. In many communities that have been impacted by fear of Black, Indigenous, people of color, we have stand your ground laws that were initially intended for intruders breaking into your home. But in some of these communities, this stand your ground law has been extended out into being in the community. And so now we have an encounter between somebody from Neighborhood Watch and a youth that is Black, Indigenous, person of color. There's an altercation. The youth is killed because of how Black, Indigenous, people of color are portrayed in the media, right? It's helped to impact this unconscious bias that we talked about, which is so dangerous. And now we have a youth that has died and a person who gets off on this Black, Indigenous, child of color's murder. Why? We can look at this engine of structural racism and see how each piece plays a role, right? Housing gear is twirling. Suspension from school because we have Black, Indigenous, people of color much more likely to be suspended from school. Stand your ground laws that were put into place because of some of the sensitivity around people of color, right? So then we have the criminal justice gear twirling. And we have how people of color are portrayed in the media, which impacts somebody's unconscious bias, which we can think back to the video game, right? That showed us that the black intruder is way more likely to be seen as a threat than the white intruder. So this is showing us how this idea of structural racism is impacting whole groups of people. Why we have to consider structural racism when we're interacting with people of color, when we're serving people of color. So we really can't talk about cultural competence or bias if we don't take a look at historical trauma. I love to use this image because this is me in preschool, and I lived in a very Jewish community. So I'm here with all of my Jewish friends and my Jewish teacher, Diane. It was the 70s, so it was cool to call teachers by their first name. And so here I am with all of my Jewish friends. And so if you look at this image and you consider everything, you would think, well, we all should have similar trajectory in life, right? We are having the same education. We live in the same community. Our parents have similar occupations. Our parents have similar level of education. We have similar socioeconomic status. If we look at all of those factors, and, I almost left out my favorite part, is that my Jewish friends have the history of the Jewish Holocaust in their past, and I have the history of the African slave trade Holocaust in my ancestry, right? So the trajectory really should be similar for all of us. So let's take a look at how that trajectory changes. Dr. Yellow Horse Braveheart Jordan is a pioneer in this work of historical trauma. And specifically, she worked, she did a lot of study in the Native American community. Now, when we talk about historical trauma, collective trauma, and intergenerational trauma, we're talking about the same phenomenon, but we're looking at it from 3 different perspectives. So historical trauma, of course, is looking at an incident that happened in the past that might have incited trauma in somebody. Collective trauma is referring to the fact that trauma impacts us as a collective, right? So normally we, as Western people, we move through the world often forgetting that we really are very interconnected, right? And we really are a collective. So what happens to one of us impacts the collective. And now that we have COVID-19, I love to use this as an example because in this case, the collective is the entire, human race, right? As a collective, we are impacted by COVID-19. Maybe we have not been sick. Maybe none of our family members have been sick. Maybe no one that we know has been sick. But we are still impacted as a collective because society has changed, right? Rules have changed. The way we shop in the grocery store has changed. So we're impacted as a collective by the trauma which has been COVID-19. And intergenerational trauma is just referring to the fact that trauma can be passed from one generation to the next. So historical trauma, collective trauma, intergenerational trauma, all are referring to the same phenomenon. Now, Dr. Braveheart Jordan describes trauma as historical trauma is a trauma that is multi-generational and cumulative over time. It extends beyond the lifespan. Historical trauma response has been identified and is delineated as a constellation of features in reaction to the multi-generational, collective, historical, and cumulative psychic wounding over time, both over the lifespan and across generations. I know that everybody can read, so I didn't need to read that for you, but I like to say it out loud because it's such an expansive definition, and it really hits on all the points that are important in understanding historical trauma, and therefore very important in interacting with people of color, with serving people of color, with providing for people of color, leading people of color. And before we move on, I want to point out the idea of, again, multi-generational, cumulative, over time. Soul wound. When we look from a Native American perspective, you might hear the terms soul wound, which Duran describes as a wound to the soul of indigenous people that is felt in agonizing proportions. Once the core from which soul emerges is wounded, then all emerging mythology and dreams of a people reflect the wound. You will also hear the terms spiritual injury, soul sickness, soul wounding, and ancestral hurt. All of those terms, again, are referring to the same phenomenon, but looking at them from a different perspective. And of course, from a Native American or indigenous perspective, Duran is looking at more of the root cause of all of the other things that happen as a result of historical trauma or as a result of the soul wound. And what he's saying is there's a wound on the soul level, right? There's something that happens way down on the level of the soul, of the essence of a person. And when there's an injury that happens there, then you have all of the subsequent symptoms that we'll talk about in a bit. So I think it's just important to point out the difference between a Western perspective and an indigenous perspective. And when I say indigenous, often we use indigenous to talk about Native Americans, but in this context, I often use indigenous to talk about any people that are indigenous to a specific place. So when we look at it from an indigenous perspective, we are looking at root cause. And when we're looking from a Western perspective, we're looking more in the physical world, right? In a physical response, in a physical way. And when we look at those two differences, we again see another perspective that we have to consider when we're working with and relating to people of color. Because this transcends beyond just this concept, and it even transcends into some of our ideas about wellness, right? Some of our ideas about medicine. We have Western medicine that looks at symptoms and kind of chases symptoms, right? And then we have more traditional and indigenous medicine that's looking for root cause of dis-ease and causes of dis-ease on a spiritual level. So again, some of these ideas transcend across the entire ethos of a people. Sotero talks about 3 sequential stages of historical trauma. So the first stage, mass trauma experience, where the dominant group subjugates a population, resulting in segregation and displacement, physical and psychological violence, economic destruction, and cultural dispossession. The pieces there that are important. Now, normally when we talk about trauma, we talk about historical trauma, we acknowledge the physical and the psychological violence. We acknowledge emotional destruction. But we often forget to talk about segregation and displacement, right? Displacement, we've talked about the trail. I'm sure you've heard the Trail of Tears. You have looked at how people of Mexican origin have been displaced in the Southwest, right? And of course, if we look at African people living in America, or African Americans or Black Americans, we're talking about the displacement from the continent of Africa. And so displacement is an important thing to think about and consider. And we often don't talk about the economic destruction that happens, right? I talked earlier about redlining. And when you have redlining in communities, you prevent people from owning property. You prevent people from owning businesses. So there's economic destruction of a people. Or you have things like Black Wall Street that once existed that was burnt down to economically destroy Black people in the South. So again, and then we have cultural dispossession, which is something that I'll go into pretty heavily in a few slides, but the stripping of somebody's culture and the stripping of cultural identity and how that impacts a person's ability or a group's ability to be resilient against adversity. The second stage, according to Sotero, a trauma response is elicited in the first or primary generation that includes physical, social, and psychological responses. And number 3, the responses are transmitted to subsequent generations through epigenetics, which we'll get into later, environmental factors, psychosocial factors, social, economic, political systems, and legal and social discrimination. Okay, the cycle of historical trauma. And this is another important, really important piece of information. When we are talking about the history of trauma and the history of, or historical trauma, right? If we start there, we have an individual that has a history of trauma or comes from a history of historical trauma. They'll have they potentially can have a traumatic stress reaction, right? Which includes grief and other strong emotional and physical reactions. Once we have those traumatic stress reactions, we have the increased risk of substance abuse and dependence, and then we have the increased vulnerability of suicidality and mental disorder, right? So PTSD, anxiety, depression. Once we have those increased risks, we have the increased risk of experiencing other traumas like accidents, violence, physical and sexual abuse. And then we come back around to the cycle of history of trauma and historical trauma. Earlier, when we looked at Dr. Yellowhorse Braveheart's definition of historical trauma, she talked about it being cumulative. When we looked at Sotero's sequential stages of trauma, we talked about cumulative. Trauma, the historical trauma is cumulative, right? It builds one generation after the next, and this cycle continues and continues and continues. Let's take a look at cultural genocide. So if we look at the Native American community, over the past 227 years, the federal government used 6 different strategies to address America's Indian problem, with varying degrees of fallout, some minor and others devastating. So I think certainly when we're talking about working with the Native American community, we really have to consider what has happened over this period of time. The 6 different strategies that were used and how this has impacted this overall group as a people. I want to be clear in this point to emphasize that we have over 500 tribes that are recognized by the federal government. We have another 1,000 or so tribes that may not be recognized by the federal government, but each one of those tribes have a very different and specific culture. So we want to be very careful about grouping all Native American people into one group, because each tribe has a very distinctive culture. In this space, I'm talking about Native Americans as a whole and what has happened to Native American people as a whole throughout this period of time. So initially, the United States government said that there would be an agreement between equals. And in this agreement between equals, if Native American people were willing to give up some of their land, the federal government promised that they would prosecute United States citizens that committed crimes against Native American people, that they would not allow people to steal their land, and that no U.S. citizen could settle on Native American land, and that there would always remain peace and friendship and goodwill between Native Americans and the United States government. So this agreement between equals really never happened, because there was a lot of deception in the treaties that were signed. There was a lot of deception, there were lies, and that really never happened. The next stage was removal and reservations. So in 1828, Andrew Jackson was elected the 7th president of the United States. In 1829, gold was discovered on Cherokee territory. And in 1830, the Indian Removal Act was passed. So we know really that things that have happened throughout this time was really about greed, right? Really about resources and trying to take resources. Because as soon as it was discovered that there were resources in territory in Cherokee territory, we had the Indian Removal Act passed, and therefore the Trail of Tears. So we think about the Trail of Tears often as directly impacting the Cherokee tribe, but in reality, it was the Cherokee and 40 plus tribes that were also impacted and forced to be removed from their land. And it was done in a very harsh and cruel way, often in the middle of the night, thousands of troops coming to push people off their land, burning their dwellings, killing their cattle, not allowing people to have their blankets and items to keep them warm. It was the dead of winter, and many, many, many Native American people perished during the various trails of tears that happened to numerous tribes. Next, we move to allotment and assimilation. And during the allotment and assimilation period, the idea was to, quote, civilize Native Americans, right? This is the terminology that was used, to save the man and kill the Indian. In doing this, there were Native American boarding schools that were established by the United States government in collaboration with various religious churches. So, of many different denominations, but the church and the government worked together to create these boarding schools. And the idea of the boarding school was to strip Native Americans of their cultural identity. So during this allotment and assimilation period, the government, and it's often described as sending, I've heard some elders describe it as sent blue government vehicles out to the different reservations, and every child that was age 5 or older was removed from the family and brought to live in these boarding schools. And during school breaks, they were still either required to remain in the boarding school or they were sent to live with dominant culture families, but not returned to the Native American families that they came from. So if we look at this process and we look at the abuse that happens when we're trying to strip somebody of their identity, right? So if children were speaking in their native tongue, they were beaten or mouths washed out with soap. If they acted in ways that they did in traditional ways that were in alignment with their tribal grooming and their tribal upbringing, they were beaten. All of their hair, especially for male children, all the hair was cut off, which is devastating, right? Because for many indigenous people, hair has a spiritual significance. So the idea was to strip Native American people of their culture. Now, if we look at how this has impacted the family structure, what we know is that Black, Indigenous people of color, the foundation for our communities is absolutely family. Family is the foundation for everything that we do. It's the foundation for the communities, and especially important in egalitarian societies. Now, if we have removed children from the age of 5 from their parents, the parents are now remaining without children to raise. And they'll one day be grandparents, right? But they have not had the experience of raising their children past the age of 5. All of those children that have been removed from their families and grow up in this boarding school environment grow up without experiencing parenting, right? They don't experience having parents. They experience having people who are meant to strip their identity from them. So they don't have the experience of parenting. They don't have the experience of living in a family unit, which means they're not experiencing how to be siblings and how to maintain family structure, right? Well, at some point, all of these children that are being groomed in this fashion are going to grow up. They're going to turn 18. They're going to graduate from the boarding school and then go out into the world and create their own families. Well, once they start creating their own families, they don't know how to have the role of the parent, right? Because they have not experienced the role of the parent. They may not know how to groom their children to take on a healthy role of sibling because they have not experienced living the role of being a sibling. So if we follow this, right, we can see where we have the destruction of the family unit. And in cultures where we have the destruction of the family unit, we're going to have destruction of the culture, and we're going to have issues within the community itself. And so because the boarding school tragedies are as recent as the 80s, we still have grandparents that have lived through some of these tragedies. And of course, we have to be careful not to stereotype, and we have to be careful not to assume that every single Native American person that has gone through living in boarding schools has gone through the same trauma, has experienced trauma in the same way, has the same trauma response, has any trauma response. I've heard some elders say that they lived in a boarding school and it was a good experience for them. But what I do know is that in Canada, what is termed Aboriginal in Canada, right? So Aboriginal people in Canada that have gone through living in boarding schools were awarded certain financial reparations, and they had a Truth and Reconciliation Committee come in and have a call to action for the Canadian government to change certain things into law as a result of what some of these people experienced living in residential schools. So it has heavily impacted Native American people in the United States and Aboriginal people in Canada, and certainly impacted the Native American family structure. I can think of a woman in her late 50s recently that expressed gratitude for learning how to show her grandchildren affection, how to be affectionate and loving toward her grandchildren in, our Western way through, a lot of hugging and saying, I love you, and so forth and so on, because her parents had grown up in boarding schools and didn't show that affection to her, and she therefore did not know how to show that with her children and then the grandchildren that she was raising. So we can see this as an issue that is still persistent in the family structure today. And this is true not just of Native Americans, but of many groups of color. The boarding school is specific to the Native American and Aboriginal people of Canada, and it's a very good example of what was happening during this time of allotment and assimilation. After that period, we moved into the Indian reorganization period, and this happened because prior to World War I, even though this was Native American land, Native Americans were not allowed to be citizens of the United States, but because of their courageous battle during World War I, the United States government granted United States citizenship. And once we had this Indian reorganization, which was, Native Americans becoming citizens, it was said to be because of their performance in World War I and willingness to serve in the military. But this reorganization also allowed Native American people to be taxed, right? Because now if you're considered a United States citizen, you can be taxed and your land can be taken if you don't pay taxes on it, so forth and so on. So during this time, there was still the motivation around money and resources. After that period, we moved into termination and relocation. And so the termination part involved changing the status of tribes as being sovereign to people being private citizens, again, with taxable land holdings and assets that could be confiscated. And so the being an Indian at that time was terminated. And for people willing to give up traditional ways of being, they were granted extra land and granted other privileges if you were willing to give up your traditional ways of being. And after termination and relocation, we moved to the period that we're still currently in, which is self-determination. And we moved into this stage with the idea of strengthening the Native American sense of autonomy without threatening the sense of community. Because in the past, there was this, you must give up your way of being if you want to have certain privileges. And this was destructive for the people, right? This did not allow for a lot of self-determination. So in this space, in the self-determination stages, we started with education assistance, allowed tribes to start to govern themselves, gave assurance that the federal government would protect their property and their rights, and they would be their natural resources would also be protected. So it was to open the door for more self-determination. We still have a lot more work to do. If we take a look at people of Mexican origin, the legacy of Spanish colonialism, compounded by Anglo-American neocolonialism, has led to the internalization of negative perceptions and stereotypes by Mexican Americans, leading to self-hate and alienation, lowered self-esteem, ethnic identity conflict, discrimination, racism, and marginalization. And Dr. Antonio Estrada out of U of A, University of Arizona, is one of the only scholars to talk about historical trauma as it pertains to people of Mexican origin. And what we know is that this idea, again, of separating families and family destruction has been occurring since the end of the Mexican American War. So, at the end of the Mexican American War, when Mexico seceded, 2/3 of their country to the United States, we started to have the borders, and that those borders separated families. And so this idea of what's currently happening at the border, this is not new. This has been occurring since the end of the Mexican American War. We're just seeing it again today. So once again, we're talking about separation of family and therefore destruction of the family unit, and therefore causing a lot of dis-ease in our communities. If we take a look at the African Holocaust, Africans across the diaspora have endured over 400 years of slavery, colonization, abuse, and loss of cultural identity. More than 90% of Africans throughout the diaspora carry slave master last names, and most don't know their country of origin. I have searched and searched and searched for the statistics around the number of Africans throughout the diaspora. That means, Africans that are not living on the continent that have slave master last names, and it's very difficult to find the accurate numbers for that, but huge amounts of African people do not even have the knowledge of their last names, other than what they were called, what their ancestors were called when they were owned during slavery. And then we have this destruction of the African family structure. There's a document called the Willie Lynch Letters, which talks about a system that was put into place for slave owners to keep people enslaved for at least 400 years. And a lot of those, that the psychological actions that were taken, we can still see the ramifications of those within African American culture right now today. So some of the things that were done on plantations where the Africans that lived there were allowed to have family units, right? We weren't always allowed to be married. It was most often illegal for us to be married, but sometimes we were allowed to live in a family structure. When we had those family structures, there was a conscious effort, one, to keep the male, the adult male, away from the home. Keep the adult male in the fields and away from the adult female in the home. Now, of course, we have gender difference and family structure difference now. So what I'm referring to is during those times when we had a specific female role and more specific male roles. So keep the male away from the family, and in keeping the male away from the family, You teach the female, the woman in the family, to take on all the household responsibilities so that when the male comes back into the household, he's displaced. He really has no place within the household. And that will cause a disruption in balance within the household and an issue of balance within the family structure. Additionally, males were used to be studs. So the more property the slave master owned, the more wealth he had, right? So take these black males and have them procreate with as many females on the plantation as possible, and then the slave owner becomes wealthier and wealthier. Additionally, take the biggest, blackest, most rebellious slave on the plantation and beat him within an inch of his life, or even kill him in front of everybody else on the plantation. So gather the entire plantation around, take the biggest, blackest, most rebellious slave and beat him. And what happens is you teach the women to really love their sons, not teach them to be rebellious, not teach them to be too prideful, but teach them to kind of go unnoticed and to be very docile. But take the girl children, the female children, and groom them to be strong, groom them to take on all the roles, have very high expectation for the female, the girls in the family. And we still see today where the girls in traditional black families, traditional African American families with a more traditional structure, the expectation level is higher. The education level is higher. The earned income is higher. And we have many black mothers that we love our sons, but we don't always teach them everything that they need to know to be self-sufficient. So some of this comes some of this is generational, intergenerational, and has been passed from one generation to the next, and we still see it within the community today. And so if we have communities where the woman in a household with traditional gender roles, if we have the woman that does all the tasks, right? And this is how we're groomed to be able to handle all of the tasks in the home and do the child rearing and do the cleaning and do the cooking and work and be educated and have all the tasks. Where does the person with the traditional male role fit? And even in homes that don't have traditional gender roles, that have a different set of gender roles, there has to be some level of balance. Somebody has to have one role and somebody else has to take another role. When we don't have balance in those roles, we have destruction of the family unit. And when we have destruction in the family unit, we're going to have dis-ease within the community. We then have the continued issue of the family in Black Indigenous communities, because we have Black Indigenous people of color children are removed from the home more frequently and for longer periods of time, right? So CPS or, Child Protective Services is way more likely to remove children of color and for longer periods of time. We have the incarceration of people of color, specifically, men of color, and, in high numbers, Black men of color, Black men being incarcerated. And then we have the murder of people of color. So all of these things contribute to the destruction of families in communities of color, which then starts to cause dis-ease within the communities, but also decreases the resilience that's necessary to overcome adversity. We're starting to get pretty deep into the information, and I'm nervous to take a break because I feel like we won't be able to finish all of the information. But please, if you need to get up, if you need to stretch your legs, go to the bathroom, any of the things that you need to do, please feel free to do that at any point in time during the presentation. But I think we better keep going to make sure that we get everything covered. So if we look at three phases of historical trauma, and this is not to say that any one group is more important than the other. I utilize these three groups because I have some points that I want to make, and it allows me to illustrate those points quite readily. So in this illustration, we are looking at the Jewish Holocaust, the Native American genocide, and the transatlantic slave trade tragedies. Not that these are most important, they just illustrate the point that I want to make. If we look at factors of resilience, and this is kind of going back to looking at the trajectory that I talked about when I showed the picture of me in preschool among, me, the black girl, among all of my Jewish friends. We can take a look at why the trajectory might change. So if we look at some factors of resilience, like common language, religion and culture, ceremonial practices, names, and connection to homeland. Let's look at those 5 factors as factors for resilience. If we take a look at survivors of the Jewish Holocaust, what we know, and Dr. Rachel Yehuda out of New York City has done a lot of the historical trauma work in this particular community. And if we look at second and third generation Holocaust survivors, what she found was that there was an actual change in the expression of the DNA, even when those second and third generation survivors were not exposed to stories, discussions, or information about the Holocaust. So even without interacting with grandparents or great-grandparents about the Holocaust, they still found a change in the expression of the DNA. At the same time, Dr. Rachel Yehuda's studies also indicate that people of Jewish origin that live in Israel fare far better than their brethren that live any place else in the world. So Jews that are living in Israel are having less incidents of anxiety and depression, substance abuse, and some of the other issues that go along with being exposed to trauma. It's less likely for people that are living in Israel as opposed to Europe, South America, North America, Central America, etc. Part of this is believed to be because while living in Israel, they are exposed to factors that mitigate some of the damage from trauma. So let's look at some of it. If we look at common language, within the Jewish community, Yiddish is still spoken. So remember, I told you I grew up in a very Jewish community. Now, we don't have time for me to start bringing out my Yiddish, but words like, when we say schmear on a bagel, like, the word schmear, this is a Yiddish term. So Yiddish is still used within the Jewish community. In the Native American community, we've had a great loss of language, right? We're trying to revive language now in the Native American community. One, because the federal government can say you're no longer identified as a federally recognized tribe if a certain percentage of your people don't speak the language, number one, but also because reviving language is helping to heal some of the historical trauma. So we see that there's been a loss of common language in Native American communities. And of course, in African communities, African American communities, there's a loss of language. Because if you understand, Africa, of course, is a continent, right? And we have 55 countries in the continent of Africa, and we have thousands of dialects. So even in the relatively small area where the slave trade occurred, there are many, many, many different dialects. So if you travel in, a 5 mile, 10 mile radius, you can encounter, even right now today, you can encounter, 5 different dialects in that small, area. So there was loss of language from the very beginning, because once we were put onto those ships and we all come from different tribes and have different cultures, we all also had different languages and were not able to communicate with one another. So loss of language. If we look at religion and culture in the Jewish community, Judaism, still one of the largest religions in the world, right? The culture is still strong. We don't see that in the Native American community. We don't see that among Africans living off of the continent often, right? Because for Native Americans, the animism that they traditionally practiced, was disrupted by colonization, right? And we had Catholicism and many different denominations of Christianity impact many tribes. And so that connection to religion and therefore culture is lost. When we think of religion and culture, we have to understand that in most indigenous communities and really outside of the Western world, culture and religion are one and of the same. It's very difficult to separate culture from religion. And the same thing happened for Africans from the continent. So in the country where my people originate, Benin Republic, West Africa, once known as Dahomey, it was illegal for us to practice our traditional religion even on the continent in our own country until 1992. No, I didn't make a mistake. I said 1992. So all the way until that time, we had a loss of religion. So it was practiced underground. It was brought to the United States, and of course, it was bastardized and changed a lot because it started to incorporate other practices. So there's been a tremendous loss of religion and culture within the various African communities. Ceremonial practices. We still, in the Jewish community, we still see bris ceremonies, right? The circumcision ceremonies are still happening. Bar mitzvahs and bat mitzvahs, Jewish weddings. We still have ceremonial practices. In Native American communities, we have a decrease in ceremonial practices. And certainly depending on where the community is located, right? If we're talking about some of the communities that are very close to us here, in the Phoenix area, you'll see fewer ceremonies than if we're talking about, like maybe Navajo Nation. In remote areas of Navajo Nation, you'll see a lot more ceremony there. But overall, there's been a decrease in ceremony among Native American people, and certainly among Africans, because we lost all of our ceremonial practices because most of us don't know where in Africa we come from. We don't really have an idea of the country that we come from, most of us, and certainly not the culture within that country that we come from. Last names. Many Jewish people did have to change last names at Ellis Island, and at other times. There was the necessity to change last names. So we can't say that there was never the issue of last names, but many Jewish people still have their names intact. They still know of their ancestors' names, right? Sometimes in Native American communities, we will hear people have their traditional last names, but oftentimes we'll start to hear, like Smith and other Anglo names, or we'll start to hear Spanish names as well. And of course, like we talked about earlier, most African Americans have no idea of their ancestral last names, right? Because all of your Joneses and Johnsons and Williams and Smiths, all of these are slave names. These are the names of people who once owned our ancestors. So every time that African American person opens their mouth to even say their name, that imprint of ownership is still there, consciously or unconsciously, that imprint is there because that's all we know. That's all we connect to in terms of our origin, right? And so how does that impact the people? Connection to homeland. It's land is very important to Indigenous people. We have a very strong connection to our ancestral land, and it's important for us to maintain that connection. And that is so evident in the Jewish community that it's the birthright of every Jewish person to, at some point in life, go to Israel. And if they cannot afford it personally, there are organizations that help them make that journey home. That's how important it is to have connection to ancestral land. Native American tribes, many of them, underwent Trail of Tears and lost the connection to their homeland. And of course, for Africans, African Americans, Black people in America, we know that we've had a complete loss of land for most of us because we have no idea where we come from. So if we look at those 5 points and we consider them ways of having resilience, we can see that when there's a stripping of cultural identity, it's a very difficult thing for that group of people to overcome adversity. Could that be why, if we look at the trajectory of the Jewish children versus the trajectory of the Black children, can that be why there's a difference? There are all those factors for resilience in current day and in the history, right? So Jewish people can start to recalibrate, right? Can start to get better. Not that the Holocaust was not a horrible, horrible, horrible crime committed against humanity. Absolutely it was. Absolutely it was. But the ability to become resilient has helped that group overcome some of that. And then when you look at some of the factors, some of the markers that we can look at to determine resilience, right? We look at substance abuse, incarceration, income disparity, illiteracy rates, violence in communities. If we use some of those things as markers to determine the overall wellness of the communities, we see that in the Jewish communities where there's been that ability to have those resilience factors, we're not seeing some of those same markers that indicate dis-ease within the community. In the Native American and African American communities, we're seeing markers that indicate dis-ease. And as we look at the markers that indicate dis-ease, we're also looking at the factors for resilience that are not present. So when we look at that trajectory, if we look at, well, why have, Jewish people been able to overcome the Holocaust, and African people are still talking about slavery, or Native American people are still talking about genocide, we've got to take a look at some of these factors. Additionally, we have to take a look at the ever expanding definition of whiteness, which initially our definition of whiteness excluded Italians and Irish and Jewish people, right? But as time went on, that definition expanded and included those groups. So that the ever expanding definition of whiteness, in addition to some of these resilient factors, have to be considered when we look at historical trauma and the ability to overcome historical trauma. And why would we still be talking about slavery and genocide today? Epigenetics. When we talked earlier about historical trauma being intergenerational, this is some of what we were talking about. The study of changes in organisms caused by modification of gene expression rather than the alteration of the genetic code itself. So we are not implying that the actual genetic code changes, but what we are implying is that your environment, the environment impacts gene expression. Environment impacts gene expression. If we want to look at it on a cellular level, right? If we look at stem cells, we know that we take a stem cell from one area of the body and put that stem cell in another area of the body. The stem cell will become whatever environment it's in. So if we take the stem cell and we put it into the brain, it becomes a brain cell. If we take the stem cell and we put it with bone, it becomes bone. The epigenetic component is talking about how we interact with the environment and how the environment can change the gene expression, how the environment alters gene expression. It's a very, very powerful concept, right? Because if we think about how we interact with the environment, well, we interact with the environment through our senses, right? What we see, what we hear, what we feel, what we taste, what we touch, on and on. But also our genes interact, our DNA interacts with the environment. And based on the environment, the expression of that DNA will change. So if we are interacting in a hostile environment, our DNA is going to adapt to that hostile environment, and our gene expression is going to change, be altered in order to adapt to a hostile environment. So it's very interesting, right? It's very interesting if we start looking at the history of various groups of people and how the history impacts what we see in the community today, and why we are still talking about the slave trade or genocide or the Holocaust. What is epigenetics? Well, epigenetics is the emerging area of scientific research that shows how environmental influences actually affect the expression of their genes. So it's extremely important when we're talking about children and infants, at that early stage of life where we're more pliable. It's important to have a solid and secure foundation, because the environment can impact the genes for the future, right? It can impact genetic expression in that child's future. So what we learn is that genes are not set in stone, and that we can stop this dispute between nature versus nurture, because most of the time it's both. So during development, the DNA that makes up our genes accumulates genetic marks that determine how much or how little of a gene is expressed. And the collection of those chemical marks, that's known as the epigenome. So the different experiences children have rearrange those genetic marks, those chemical marks. And so this explains why identical twins can have different behaviors, different skills, different health, different achievement. Because remember that the interaction with a hostile environment also impacts physical health. So again, young brains are particularly sensitive to epigenetic changes, and it's very important that young children experience nurturing and loving, solid, and supportive relationships at a very early age, because this will impact genetic expression later on. And for me, I think, this is the beauty of epigenetics, because, it's not just to say, trauma is so terrible and it's going to be passed from one generation to the next and we're doomed. No. What epigenetics is teaching us is that we have some control over what happens in the future. We're not doomed, because just like trauma can be passed from one generation to the next, positive experiences can be passed from one generation to the next. Stable, loving, solid environments can produce positive health outcomes in the life of that child. So it's important to see it from both perspectives, which is the beauty, I think, in learning it, because we learn that we have hope and we have control over what happens down the road and in future generations. When we talk about epigenetic changes, we have to be very careful because we have always had this issue, right, about one group being genetically superior than another group. So we're not talking about changes as a result of race, or we're not talking about superiority, one race being superior, genetically superior than another race. What we're talking about is that genetic changes are a result of the environment. So epigenetic changes occur based on the environment, because epigenetic changes are talking about the epigenome, that collection of chemical markers that become impacted by environment. So this has absolutely nothing to do with race. Any ethnic group that's exposed to chattel slavery, genocide, or overt discrimination will experience epigenetic changes in response to the trauma. Because again, it's in an effort to adapt to that environment. It's an effort to adapt to a hostile environment. Or epigenetic changes occur, maybe the previous genetic expression was for a hostile environment, right? And then we create a positive, loving, supportive environment. Some of those same genes that might have been switched on before based on a hostile environment might now become switched off based on a positive and loving environment. So it's both ways. There are changes as a result of the environment, because not only our senses interact with the environment, but our genetic material interacts with the environment. Hidden collective memories of trauma, or a collective non-remembering, is passed from one generation to the next, as are what some, I'm quoting here, but it's also a little difficult to say maladaptive, because the changes are not really maladaptive. The changes are adaptive based on the environment, right? But the collective memories of trauma or collective non-remembering is passed from generation to generation, as are some of the social and behavioral patterns that are symptoms of many social disorders caused by historic trauma. So what we're saying is that there are certain behaviors and adaptations that are a result of trauma that manifest as a disorder or maladaptive social and behavioral patterns. So, for instance, if we had several generations ago, right, if we are, let's say, on the continent in West Africa where the slave trade is happening, and there's one of my ancestors that knows that someone is here capturing Africans, not really sure who that might be or when that could happen or where people are hiding, or is it a European person or is it a person from another tribe? We're not sure who's perpetuating this, right? But we know that there's a likelihood that I could get stolen, and the rumor is that you get stolen and you go to a foreign land and you never return. So as I move around in my typical day-to-day life, maybe I become hypervigilant because I'm concerned that something might happen to me. So I'm paying attention to everything that's going on around me. If I hear a rustle in the trees, I'm looking. If I hear footsteps that don't sound familiar, I'm cognizant of that. I tune in to every sound that I hear. I tune in to every energy that I feel, right? Because I'm not sure what's going to happen to me. I'm not sure if it is or if it isn't, but I better be aware, right? So that's going to cause certain epigenetic changes. So suppose generations after that particular ancestor also have unstable environments, dysregulated environments. That gene can remain switched on, right? That gene expression can remain switched on for hypervigilance. If I get to, let's say, 2021, and I'm in the classroom and I'm hypervigilant, right? Which, because that gene is still, turned on, and I'm hypervigilant, what's going to happen? Well, I'm going to be diagnosed with something, right? I'm going to be called ADHD. I'm going to be called, any number of things. But is it ADHD or one of these, other diagnoses? Or is this an adaptation that remained from something that happened in the past? This is the idea of epigenetics. And the cherry blossom, there's a study called the cherry blossom study that you can look up and get information about. And the cherry blossom study suggests that some of this can go for 14 generations. Suggestions. So the result of epigenetic changes. We already talked about changes are adaptation for survival. There are behavioral changes, cognitive abilities, decision making, the aging of DNA that happens. And we see the aging of DNA in the physical health outcomes. So I mentioned briefly earlier, I emphasized physical health and how the physical health can be impacted by epigenetic changes. Well, what we find is that people who have been historically under stress and have had to interact with hostile environments, in these communities, we see a lot more what? Heart disease, diabetes, lung disease. These are the physical manifestations of the trauma, the aging of the DNA. We are driven to procreate as a result of epigenetic changes because, again, that's survival, right? That's a hot topic, right? That's a hot button topic. So we have to say that one really carefully because people get very offended. And procreation happens in communities, a lot of procreation happens in communities for many reasons. Maybe it's cultural, and so forth and so on. But we're also wired for it because we're wired for survival. So we often hear people say stuff like, why would somebody living in Afghanistan, let's say, just as an example, because of the war and because of the danger that happens there often, why would they keep having children? And we have judgment around this, right? Well, some of things can be cultural, but we're also wired that way. We're wired for survival. These are some of the epigenetic changes. Intergenerational changes, again, referring to the fact that the changes happen from one generation to the next, right? So The epigenetic changes that are happening can happen within the lifetime of one person, but it can also be passed from one generation to the next to the next. There are cultural changes that happen as a result of epigenetic changes, and there are entire cultures built around trauma, right? In the Native American, African American, Mexican American, Latinx communities. So we build whole cultures around trauma. So, for instance, I work a lot in the Native American community, Gila River Indian community. And there's also people often, providers often struggle to have trust with clients, right? To be trusted by clients. Well, if we look back at the boarding school issue, we look back at the time of allotment and assimilation and all these things where the government is removing people, the government is trying to force people to assimilate. We have issues that DNA, was used in ways that DNA should not have been used in many different types of community, in Native American communities, in African American communities. There's a level of distrust, right? So we build this culture around the trauma that we've had in the past, right? It's, in African American communities, we probably aren't calling the police often, right? We're not necessarily comfortable calling the police. So, we have, this culture around we don't snitch, right? We don't tell certain things. We don't say certain things. We don't involve the government. We don't involve the police. This becomes a culture that's built around the trauma of being perpetrated against, right? So sometimes people get confused and say, oh, well, people in those communities don't care about violence or don't care about domestic violence, don't care about this, don't care about that because they don't call the police. Well, no, that's a culture that we have built due to trauma, right? And in addition to traditionally, we had other ways of managing the issues in our communities. That's one of the other things. But we also have culture built around the trauma that we have experienced. So before we judge people or, we create our stereotypes, we have to have an understanding of why we see certain things that we see, or what history different groups have. What's the history of their interaction with the United States government? What's the history of their interaction with dominant culture? And we can have an understanding of why maybe there are certain behavioral patterns that we see, or why the community appears to operate in one way or another. And of course, this can change from tribe to tribe, from community to community, and it can be different from one, African community in the Northeast versus an African community in the South, right? All these things are changing. But that's the idea of we have to take our glasses off, that we use when experiencing the world, and understand that other people experience the world and perceive the world through different lenses. And it's not that we need to understand all of the possibilities that go along with that, but we do need to understand that it is different for everybody, and everybody does not experience the world in the same way. And if we can get an understanding of that, then we can be a lot more compassionate and a lot more loving and interact with people in a different way. Good old Deepak Chopra and Rudolph Tanzi, who are professors of neurology at Harvard Medical School, every day brings new evidence that the mind-body connection reaches right down to the activities of our genes. How this activity changes in response to our life experience is referred to as epigenetics. So, regardless of the nature of the genes we inherit from our parents, dynamic change at this level allows us almost unlimited influence on our fate. And this is the beauty of epigenetics. We have unlimited influence. So, as we move in the world and as we serve the communities that we serve, it's so important to not just focus on the trauma that's there. We want to acknowledge the trauma that's there. We want to understand what people have been through, but we also want to look at and encourage people to know that we have control over the future. We're not just victims. And in fact, people that have gone through historical trauma and any level of trauma um, really start to have the best of both worlds when we can regulate, because we have that resilience that's there. We have built in resilience. So when we can access some of these factors for resilience and access the information and understand the ideas of epigenetics, then, we can see really the hope for our future. And as providers or as leaders or as colleagues or, as parents, we can help support the resilience and help overcome the adversity, and then look at, the human being that then stands before us, right? If we look at people not as broken and needing to be fixed, but if we look at people as whole, beautiful individuals and look at them and figure out how do we build on what's already there, how do we help people achieve the goals that they wish to achieve while building on the beautiful person that they are, then we really support change. We are really supporting people in being resilient and overcoming adversity. And that then can be passed from one generation to the next. When we look at color blindness, and we often talk about this, of course, in relationship to Black people, people of African descent. But if we look at the issue of color blindness across the spectrum, right? I'm not just talking about Black people, but I'm talking about all people across the spectrum. If I say, I'm colorblind, I don't see color. Everyone is the same. We're all the same on the inside. Everybody is equal. When I say that, even though I might have the best of intentions, this is very destructive and very painful for a person of color. Because in saying, I don't see color and I don't acknowledge difference with anyone, you're not seeing how I interact with the world. You're not acknowledging my life experience as different than yours. So you're missing me. And not only are you not acknowledging my life experience if you say that you're colorblind, or I'm missing your life experience if I say that I'm colorblind. Not only that, but what is the default norm, right? We're not all the same because I have a very different culture than perhaps you do. Maybe I have a very different religious belief. Maybe, I have things that are different. My ethics are different, or I value something that's different than what you value. If you say we're all the same and we're all equal, we fall back to the default way of being. The equal is dominant culture. Are you with me? I hope you're with me. The equal is dominant culture. So if we say we're all the same, we're all American, we're all, there's no difference between you and me. Well, no, there's a difference because I have my culture. And if you say that you don't recognize that in me, my culture is not valid because the default culture is dominant culture. That's the one right way. That's the one culture that everybody's the same in. So that's why there's this issue with saying colorblindness. As people of color, we want you to recognize that, that perhaps we have a different culture. Perhaps we have a different way of being. Perhaps we celebrate a different holiday. Perhaps we have a value that's different than yours. Perhaps we experience the world in a different way. To be trauma informed, you see me as an individual, right? You see me. That's part of the trauma informed movement. That's part of being trauma sensitive, is seeing me. So in order to see me, you have to see that I have a culture that may be different than yours. My hair may be worn in a specific way different than yours. I may have a different value than you do. I may have different religious beliefs than you do. So we encourage moving away from this color blindness because many will define this as the new racism. Culture is a collective programming of the mind that distinguishes the members of one group or category of people from another. How do we acquire culture, right? So culture is, a compilation, if you will, of attitudes, beliefs, language, customs, rituals, behavior, faith or religion, food, art, drama, music. So, how do we acquire culture, right? We acquire culture, from the generation before, from the generation before that, from the generation before that, in addition to whatever, changes have occurred in, current times due to the current environment. And this is how we acquire culture. But what happens to people who have been stripped of their culture, right? Maybe we're not sure of the attitudes that we're supposed to have. You know what I mean? You develop an unsurety. We're not sure of the beliefs we're supposed to have, or our beliefs kind of get confused. We no longer have our language. We don't know what our customs were. We don't know what our rituals were. We're not really sure of the behaviors that we're supposed to have within the culture. Our We don't know we don't have a connection to our faith, our religion. Our food has changed, or we don't, we are not connected to what the food of our culture is supposed to be. The art, the music, the drama, so forth and so on, all this changes, right? So if a person doesn't have that culture and has been stripped of their cultural identity, there's not the resilience to overcome adversity. For instance, if we look at faith and religion, and we look at how important faith and religion might be for somebody overcoming grief, right? Imagine not having the ability, if you go to church on Sunday and religion is important to you, and being in that religious space, being in the church, the religious space is important to you to overcome loss, and suddenly you don't have that. Where's your resilience going to come from? How do you become resilient to overcome some of those issues in day-to-day life? It was very interesting. I just came back from Africa, probably less than a week ago. I've been in West Africa, and my son was receiving his rites of passage. If I'm not connected to that culture that once belonged to my people, right, where I come from in Benin Republic, West Africa, there's not a lot of confidence in how I'm supposed to behave, what I'm supposed to do. In my son that was undergoing the rites of passage, there's been some issues with his behavior, some confusion. Some we're over here having this kind of behavior, and then maybe we're over here having this kind of behavior, and we're not really sure who we are, right? Going back to the culture and experiencing a rejuvenation of this is, as Ani people, this is how we behave. These are our customs. This is the type of food that we eat. We're going to go through this particular ritual to reintroduce you to our traditional ways of being. We want you to speak in our language as much as you can speak in your traditional language, right? This is fortifying him with culture, fortifying him with his identity. Because when we, as people of color, whether we are Black, whether we are, Native American, Latinx, if we are Asian American from any of the Asian countries, and I kind of, I don't even really like to say Asian American because, Asia is a whole continent, and I mean, it gets a little crazy, but, Chinese American, Korean American, Japanese American. If we are in this culture where we're not quite accepted fully into the culture, right, as evidenced by the structural racism and the racist things that occur, if we're not fully accepted into this culture, and then we have been stripped of our culture, what happens? We become lost, right? We're not sure. How are we supposed to behave? What are we supposed to do? What belongs to me? Who am I? And if we have a media that promotes people that look like this, have this type of behavior, then perhaps I learn from the media how I'm supposed to behave, right? If the, loudest voice on the block or in the community is the voice of somebody with aberrant behavior, and I'm in a space where I'm confused, and the loudest voice is the voice of a person with aberrant behavior, then I cling maybe to that behavior. I'm talking about this because this is part of what forms our biases, right? This is how that unconscious bias comes into play. This is the background for all of that, right? We have a stripping of cultural identity. We have groups of people that maybe have not had as much resilience for the adversity that they have faced. We then have certain conditions that we live in the United States that create maybe a hostile environment for us, excessive police presence, or, you know, the attitude that, Harvard did a study and showed that children that were from age 0 to 8 that were Latinx or Black were twice as likely to be perceived as lazy and stupid than their white peers. Right? So from age 0. So if we are interacting with this hostile environment from the time we're 0, right, months old, and we don't have a lot of we don't have our cultural identity, and we don't therefore have some of those resilience factors, we're going to struggle. And we're going to be in communities that are struggling. But we then have to be careful as, quote, professionals, or as Western dominant culture people. We have to be careful about having the biases and having the judgment toward the people living in communities that have been stripped of the cultural identity. Because there's going to be confusion. There's going to be some floundering. There's, the destruction of the family unit and the family structure, like we talked about. So there's going to be some issue. And it's not because of who you are as a person, or because of the values of one particular group, but a lot of that is going to come from the history of these people and their interaction in certain environments. And the next piece that we have to take a look at is how Western environment is different from some indigenous environment, or some Black, indigenous, people of color environments, right? So let's look at some of those characteristics. If we look at individualism, it's in the United States, in Western culture, we're very, we're individualists, right? We care about me. I'm important. Me, 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 me. I need to succeed. I need to be the best. We don't necessarily look at the collective. So here are some biases that can come up because of that. For example, I was in a meeting. I had brought the ACLU to a meeting in Gila River Indian community to talk about the issue of push out, where students of color are often pushed out of schools, and it's a big problem in Arizona. And the ACLU has the Right to Learn campaign to address some of these issues. Well, as the ACLU, as they presented the information, one of the markers they were looking at for how different children of color were treated versus children of dominant culture, they talked about the number of children in dominant culture that were participating in advanced placement courses or the gifted and talented classes, and said, don't you want your children to be in the gifted and talented classes? And the group of people were not responding, the Native American group, they were not responding in the way the ACLU person presenting the information expected them to respond. And that's because in Western culture, we want our kid to be the best, right? We want our kid to win first place. We want our kid to be in all the smartest, most gifted classes and be outside of the circle, right? If we have the circle, which is our egalitarian circle where we all kind of stay because we're egalitarian people, we don't want people on top of the circle. We don't want people underneath the circle. We want to stay in the circle. In Western culture, you want to be on top of the circle. You want to be the best. You want to be recognized as the best. In Gila River and in many, other Native American communities, you want to remain inside that circle. So it was not a priority for these parents or these professionals that were being talked to. It was not a priority to have students outside of the circle in the gifted and talented program. Does that mean that they don't want their children to succeed and be successful? Absolutely not. It does not mean that. But it does mean that it's important for the entire collective to be successful. So if we don't understand that Western culture has certain characteristics that are different than indigenous culture, then we look at, that group of people or the whole, right, Native American group as a whole and say, well, my gosh, the Native Americans don't care if their children go to gifted and talented. And that's just not true. But now we've created a stereotype. Now we're looking at people in a certain way. Now we're looking at them in a lower way, right, and with a bias, because we are only looking at things through our individualism lens. We are not looking at things from an egalitarian or collective lens. Only one right way. In Western culture, we like to believe that there's a right way of doing things and there's a wrong way of doing things, right? There's not really more than one way. So come on in and let me show you the right way to do things. That's how we often think in the Western culture. But in indigenous culture or with people of color, this idea is not in place. There are many ways to do things, right? There are many ways of being. Everyone doesn't have to necessarily be one religion. Everybody doesn't necessarily have to see things in only one way, because there's more of a respect for collaboration. And, where the collective comes in, working together, everybody having, a contribution, having more than one way of doing and being. If we look at fear of open conflict, and perfectionism, it kind of, in some ways, it goes together. But in Western culture, we don't like open conflict, right? We shouldn't openly question authority, or we shouldn't say things out loud to someone's face. So if we just look at fear of open conflict, right, and an issue with open conflict, and let's look at it, I really want to look at it from the perspective of dominant culture and me as a Black woman, right? So if I am interacting and my culture says that I should tell you how it is, right? In Black community, you hear all the time, yep, keep it 100, stay authentic, I gotta be me, or, we have a lot of ideas like that, right? And you also often have a lot of truth, and maybe it can feel harsh, but it's truth and it's how it is. And we have a lot of sayings that go along with telling it how it is, right? And then I interact with someone that does not like open conflict, right? If we don't put any judgment on either way of being, let's take all the judgment off of either way of being. But if I'm a person that says that I'm supposed to tell you how it is and be honest with you and put it in your face, and then there's this person over here that says it's rude to tell me something like that to my face, we're going to always have conflict, right? We're going to be butting heads. And there almost is no reason for us to butt heads, because it's really just a matter of one culture and one way of seeing things versus another. My culture dictates that I say things to your face, and my culture dictates that you don't say things to people's faces. You say it quietly, or maybe you send an email, or you do something different. Well, now as a person of color, I feel like I can't trust you because you didn't say it to my face. You said it in an email. Well, why didn't you say it to me directly? Right? And we have this back and forth when really it's just a matter of culture. One culture says we do things one way. The other culture says we do it in another way. But if we learn that there might be some cultural difference, if I'm feeling a lot of friction, maybe if I don't jump to my judgments, maybe if I don't jump to being biased, and I jump to, hey, maybe this is a cultural difference. Maybe there's something going on with my perception of things and that person's perception of things, and we yield a little bit, right? Now we have some level of understanding. Now we're not arguing over something that's unnecessary to argue about, right? We've yielded a little bit. So maybe the point has gotten across, but maybe it's gotten across in a way that has not offended the other person. And perfectionism. And that's why I say it kind of goes together, because Western culture, you're also supposed to be perfect. Your actions are supposed to be perfect. There's not a lot of room for mistake. And when you make a mistake, it's a reflection of you, or a reflection of the person that has made the mistake. In indigenous cultures, in cultures outside of dominant cultures, there's room for mistakes, because with mistake comes growth. And so everybody is not expected to be perfect. And if you make a mistake, it's not necessarily a reflection of you. It's just a mistake that's been made. So if we create environments where we develop a culture of appreciation and we make sure that we appreciate somebody's work and their effort, we're more likely to have better interaction with people of color, because that's how many of our value systems work. And by the way, let me say that Western culture permeates all of us, right? So it's not just a black and white thing, it's not just a Native American white thing, it permeates often all of us, right? So these are some things to think about that we've developed in Western culture that actually isn't healthy for anybody, right? We move to right to comfort. In Western culture, anything that is uncomfortable is an issue. We believe that we should be comfortable all the time. We are always trying to seek comfort. And I hear people say, well, but doesn't everybody? Well, now, no. Not necessarily in every culture is there always this push for comfort, because it's really only in discomfort or in adversity that we have growth, which is another reason why we, have to reframe some adversity, right? And why we reframe and say that, hey, epigenetics isn't just negativity and passing one negative thing from generation to generation. Positive things can be passed too. But this idea to right of comfort is very much a Western concept. So if we're dealing with people of color and we always feel like we have the right to be comfortable, there will be some difficulty in the interaction between you or me and an Indigenous person. Another one is paternalism. The idea that I know what's best for you. So in organizations or in relationships, like if I'm a provider and I'm working with a client from, a person of color that's my client, and I believe I know what's best for you, there's going to be a problem with that interaction, right? Paternalism is a Western concept. And in fact, I don't know what's right for my client. I need to elicit from the client what's right for them, right? I need to hear their perspective and hear what they want, hear what their idea of wellness is, right? What does wellness look like to them? And then I can facilitate and help them achieve what it is they want to achieve. But the idea that I know what's best for somebody else is going to cause a lot of conflict and cause a lot of issue, and prevent us from having the type of relationship with clients or the type of relationships with colleagues or employees that we really want to have. Wellness. A Dakota Sioux psychologist talks about wellness and says, we're trying to look at our treatments that are really working with our American Indian peoples here. And one thing that we are seeing that really works is incorporating the cultural component. It's just amazing what it's done instead of traditional psychotherapy. Because oftentimes I think that a lot of our people, especially in an urban area such as Los Angeles, have lost a lot of that cultural identity. And so exposing them to that has been the most effective in terms of their own overall wellness. So this works not only if we're talking about being a part of a healing or helping profession, but this works in anything that we're doing. So when we're working with people from diverse community, anytime we can incorporate cultural component into what we're doing, we're helping to mitigate some of the damage of trauma and historical trauma, and we're impacting the community for potentially several generations. For instance, if I'm a teacher and I incorporate cultural things into my teaching. So if I teach, maybe I don't teach on the community, maybe I teach off the community, but many of my many of my students are from the Gila River Indian community. And I incorporate O'odham language in the classroom, or I incorporate different cultural components in the classroom. If I have a model of the intricate irrigation systems that were built by the people of that community in my classroom, I'm teaching and I'm a teacher and I'm doing this whole other thing over here. But at the same time, I'm contributing to mitigating some of the damage of historical trauma. A relationship exists between history, the social, economic, and political environments, and individual experiences. Therapeutic approaches to healing that incorporate indigenous history will more effectively address root cause. Many individuals may need therapeutic help to heal from deeply personal wounds or address depression, addiction, or effects of physical and sexual abuse. So what we're saying here is that when we're dealing with therapeutic modalities, if we talk about indigenous history, we're going to more effectively address root causes. But it doesn't just have to be if we are in a therapeutic situation, right? But if we are working with youth that come from, are of color and have a history of ancestors that had a difficult background, if we teach it and talk about it, we're helping to mitigate some of the damage. We are impacting that child's life in a very helpful way. Because if you come from a community like, and I only use African American a lot because I come from that community and I feel comfortable saying those things. I always want to respect other people's culture. But so for me, as a Black woman, if I don't understand who I come from and I haven't had interaction with people from my homeland and all I'm ever connected to was I'm a descendant of slaves, how does that impact any and all things that I do in life? So any opportunity that an adult had to talk about the history of my people in a positive way or help me connect to people of African origin, even if you don't specifically know, where my people come from, but if you help me connect to that in a positive way, you're impacting me on many, many levels and potentially impacting my children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. Balance. Wellness is balance between all parts of yourself, not just being in balance intellectually or not having negative feelings. It's more a matter of being centered and grounded and connected to everybody and being in harmony with everybody, or not with everybody, but with the way life is, with your surroundings and with your family. And this is a very important piece because I come back to it often. Being in harmony with the way life is. This is not to say that we don't strive to improve or strive to do better or get better, but there are certain aspects of life that are the way they are and we cannot change them. For instance, having a lot of my family members on the continent and in the country of Benin Republic, West Africa, there's always going to be some trauma that's happening, right? They are very spiritual people. They're very connected to spirituality. They pray for me, they drum for me, they dance for me, they sing for me to help me on a spiritual level. And I send money back home to help them in the physical world because that's my contribution, right? Well, there's always going to be a time where there's some adversity. If I don't have harmony with the fact that, yes, there's going to be an issue, and yes, I'm going to need to send money home, and I might need to think about how to make that happen. If I don't have harmony with that, and I'm always butting up against that, I can never have peace and I can never have wellness. So sometimes we have to help people frame things in a way that they understand that we need to have harmony with the way life is in order to have wellness. This illustration is really so much the epitome of helping our families of color, because it's the picture of my oldest son, who's the first of his generation, and our elder, who's our supreme chief back at home. And so here's that connection of restoring the family structure, the importance of having the family structure. And he was able to go through certain ritual and ceremony as an infant, like he was supposed to do if he had still been on the continent. So it's also reintroducing the cultural ways of being and some of the religious ways and some of the faith and the behaviors that we have as our people, so that as we encounter adversity in life, he has some of those factors of resilience to help him move forward and to help him overcome. And lastly, this is my little guy when we lived in China and he was studying Kung Fu. We must mitigate the harm and leverage the strengths and become joyful warriors. I hope today's session helped you take a look at some of the history of people of color, so we can put into context perhaps some of the behaviors that we see and start to dismantle some of the stereotypes, and then of course annihilate that unconscious bias that often we carry and have impact on our relationships and on our ability to provide for people and to facilitate healing for people, or to have good, positive, strong, healthy relationships with people of color. It was such a pleasure to have you all here today. I'm happy to be ending right on time. I'm sorry I dragged you through 3 hours. I hope you got a snack and did what you needed to do during that time. Thank you so much and have a great evening. I'll see you again soon.